Our guest this week on Veterans Chronicles is Andrew Faltum. He is a U.S. Navy veteran and a veteran of the Vietnam War. Andrew, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you for having me here.
Let's start with where you were born and raised.
I was originally from Chicago, and before I joined the Navy, I was a Chicago police officer.
You were a police officer in the early 70s, so you joined after all the chaos of 1968, but how much unrest was there still going on?
Well, in 1968, I was a police cadet, which was a part-time position, like a civilian employee, during the Chicago Convention. And I remember pacing up and down in front of my TV set at home while all that chaos was going on. I joined the police department in 1970, missed out on a couple riots, but I became a burglary detective, and at one point, a couple of uniformed officers arrested a burglar, and he had to appear in court, but all they needed is a motion state for a continuance until the perpetrator could get his lawyer and the witnesses come in and testify. So I was waiting for the case to be called. It takes about 10 seconds to ask for a date for a continuance. And the court was in 26th and California on the south side of Chicago, one of those old-fashioned buildings where they had the high ceilings with the fans making lazy circles. It was packed with humanity. It was July, and I started staring out the window and thinking about being far, far away. So when my case finally got called, oh, by the way, I'd worked midnights the night before, I went down to the recruiting office in downtown Chicago and said, "Take me." So while I was filling out my paperwork, since I was a detective, I was wearing a suit. And the Lieutenant J.G., who was the recruiter, came over and said, "Sir, you could take off your jacket and, while you're filling out the paperwork." So I took off my jacket, and then after a few minutes, he came over and said, "Sir, could you put your coat back on? The secretaries are getting nervous." Got a .357 strapped to my side. So I was going to be a naval flight officer, but when I went down to Pensacola, they got around to doing brain scans, and since I had an abnormal brain, they wouldn't let me fly, but they made me an intelligence officer. So before I got commissioned, they announced the peace accords on January 27th. In 1973, I was commissioned in February, and then went on to intelligence training at Lowry Air Force Base, and that's where I met my future wife. So the old story, if the Navy wanted you to have a wife, they would have issued you one. Well, they did. So I joined the Attack Squadron 115. It was an A6 intruder squadron. They were based on the Midway with Air Wing 5, and the ship had just been sent over to Japan, so I missed the Transpac, but I joined the ship after some training in Whidbey Island on the air intelligence trade. Joined the ship there for first at sea, and I was on the Midway from 73 to 76.
Let's back up just a tad. Why did you choose the Navy? Was it to become a flight officer?
Yes. Between the Air Force and the Navy, the Air Force, if you're not a pilot, you don't have the same status. But in the Navy, the non-pilot aviation specialties were consolidated into naval flight officers. And they had the opportunities to command squadrons and higher command. So in terms of a culture for the military, the Navy offered more opportunities because I had 20/25 vision in my left eye, so I couldn't make it as a pilot. But I was going to be a naval flight officer until they found out I had an abnormal brainwave. So that's how I got into intelligence.
So back to being on board the Midway. You're off the coast of Japan at this point. The peace accords are in effect, but obviously chaos and things are devolving in Vietnam at this point.
Well, right? This was 1973, so they had signed the peace accords, and we had gotten our POWs back. But we went into the Gulf of Tonkin. The Tonkin Gulf Yacht Club had gone by that point. But we went in and rattled our sabers, and the North Vietnamese ignored us. So we came back in '75 to pick up the pieces. And on the way here, I stopped at the American History Museum and reviewed a lot of the clips they had from the Vietnam era. And a lot of it brought back memories. We operated in the Western Pacific. It was called the Overseas Family Residence Program, and that was true. Our families did reside overseas, but we were at sea as much as any other carrier, even though our home port was Yokosuka, Japan. So during that time, got to go to the Indian Ocean, hit all the garden spots in the Western Pacific, Singapore and Hong Kong, and we even got to go to Pakistan at one point. But in 1975 is when we came back to Vietnam. And what initially happened was the situation was getting critical. And we left Japan and we headed south. We stopped by Okinawa to pick up some Marine helicopters, and we took them down to the Philippines area. And we transferred the Marine helicopters to the aircraft carrier Hancock, which was an old Essex-class carrier. And they were acting as a helicopter carrier. So they were involved in what's called Operation Eagle Pull, which is the evacuation of Phnom Penh. At one point, since they were going to be acting as a helicopter carrier, we acted as their flight deck for their regular air wing. And it occurred, this cross-deck operation occurred in the San Bernardino Straits, which, if you're a student of World War II history, that's one of the 4 battles that occurred during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. And so it was kind of interesting to be up on the flight deck and see these historic straits on either side of the carrier while you're conducting flight operations. Another interesting thing was that the Hancock, being an older carrier, operated A4s, which is called scooters. They're little delta wing single engine jets. They're rather small, and they're so small that they don't even have folding wings. And when they're taxiing on the flight deck, they have these long spindly landing gear. And in order to keep them from tipping over, the flight deck crew has to hang from their armpits off the wingtips to keep the Skyhawks from tipping over. So that was an interesting experience. We were gone about 60-some days at sea with a brief import periods of 1 or 2 days. And then we were alerted for standing by off the coast of Vietnam. What we wound up doing was playing helicopter carrier. There were 3 amphibious ready groups. The Okinawa was one. The Hancock was acting as a helicopter carrier, and we were acting as a helicopter carrier. Now, the other 2 had Marine helicopter units, but we got a Air Force helicopter unit, the 56th Special Operations Wing, and there were 10 CH-53 Jolly Green Giant helicopters. But being Air Force helicopters, they didn't have retractable rotor blades. So we had to spot these helicopters around the deck, and there was really no room for the rest of our aircraft. We had flown some of them off to the Philippines, and we stowed the rest on the hangar deck. So we were a big helicopter carrier, and it was interesting for me because aboard the carrier, we had 2 06 level rank. We had the captain of the ship, Captain Larry Chambers, who became the first black naval aviator to command a carrier, also became the first to reach flag rank. And a very interesting gentleman. He had just taken over command of the ship about a month or so before. The Air Force, for 10 helicopters, had 3 colonels, 06 level. A colonel working for a colonel working for a colonel. And we gave the Air Force a lot of guff about that, because the only other 06 aboard the ship was the Chief of Staff for the embarked flag, the carrier group commander. So we waited off the coast. We prepared, and we watched the North Vietnamese moving inexorably towards Saigon. My job, I was assigned to be the ground order battle analyst. And so as the units were reported, in intelligence reporting, I made little white labels, little sticky labels, and we put them on a map that was overlaid with plastic. And so we could move the markers as the South Vietnamese forces retreated. And it got to the point where they were all converging around Saigon. And we dispensed with the map altogether and went with a photo mosaic of the Saigon area, including what's called the Rung Sat, out to Vung Tau, which is a peninsula on the coast. And as we were getting ready for the operation, I had collected all these little labels into a styrofoam coffee cup. And when the operation finally launched, I remember taking that coffee cup and dumping it into a wastebasket. And that was the Army of the Republic of Vietnam just being thrown away.
Andrew,
So-
let's stop right there for a short break. We'll pick up with this dramatic story in just a moment. We're back. This is Veterans Chronicles. I'm Greg Corumbus, honored to be joined today by U.S. Navy veteran and Vietnam War veteran Andrew Faltum. And Andrew, you were just telling us about the dramatic moment as it became clear that the South Vietnamese Army was about to be imploding as it was going around towards Saigon, that you had all these names in a coffee
Right.
cup, and
Right.
eventually
Right, all the units, and I dumped them into a wastebasket. A lot of people have talked about Ambassador Martin and his unwillingness to pull the plug. And one of the landing zones was a parking lot in the embassy, because the roof of the embassy had a heliport, but it was only big enough for a small helicopter. So they wanted to cut down this tree, this tamarack tree that was in the middle of the parking lot. And the story that we heard was that the ambassador would not allow it, but on the opposite side of the tree, away from the ambassador's window, they were slowly hacking away at the tree when he wasn't looking, so that when he finally did give the order, the tree came down. Now, the way the evacuation worked, like I said, there's 3 amphibious ready groups, and there's a lot of other shipping. There's about 40 to 50 ships involved in the evacuation operations. The CH-53s were the big cargo helicopters. They were designed to carry like 55 troops, but they were carrying like up to maybe 80 refugees. They would land, load them with as many people, and if they could get into hover, they would come back down and put some more on. Those are going from the embassy out to the amphibious ships. And then the smaller helicopters, the CH-46s, which is kind of a medium transport helicopter used by the Navy and Marines, those would take the people as soon as we processed them from our ships to other ships. And then within Saigon itself and the area around it, the Air America helos, which are the silver and blue or silver and black ones run by the CIA, they would pick up people all over. And there's a famous photo of that silver helicopter picking up somebody off of a rooftop. But they would collect to the embassy compound and then come out to the ship. And we had the Master at Arms Force and the Marine Detachment. They would get a rope. They would have somebody at the head of the rope, and everybody was told to hold on to the rope. And as they led them off the helicopters, they would take them to the other side of the island, the starboard side, where there was a sheltered area where they could process the refugees. We had foreign nationals, news people, Vietnamese.
Was there any prioritizing of who got on the choppers first?
The story that I had picked up at the museum was that Ambassador Martin did not, he just loaded it up with, they tried to get as many people who cooperated with the Americans as possible out. And so he did not want to come right away, so they had to go back and get him. And the last people out were part of the Marine detachment, which was securing the embassy landing pad. But there was a whole gamut of people. And the other part of the evacuation was the Vietnamese themselves. They had a lot of American helos, and they came out to the ship. And so they were crammed with all their families and everything. So this was really sort of after the main evacuation was supposedly over, because there are a lot of areas in the south that had not fallen yet. So they came out to the ships hoping that they would find a place to land. And I remember being up on the flight deck and looking around, and they were just circling the ship like, you know, around a wagon train, Indians around a wagon train. And they would fly up the side of the ship and throw out their weapons to show that there was no hostile intent. They would come in so fast that we'd try to wave them off, but they would just go around and land on the angle. And most of them were Hueys, which don't have any wheels. They have landing skids. So in order to get them out of the way, they were coming so fast and furious that you just had to push them over the side in order to rescue other people. So they lost a lot of aircraft, but they saved a lot of people. We, on the Midway, did about 3,000 people. The other thing that was kind of historic from Midway was Major Bung Lee. He flew out from Con Son Island, which is off the coast of Vietnam. He was in a Cessna Bird Dog, which is normally a two-place airplane, and had his wife and 5 children aboard. And they tried to communicate with him by radio, and finally he succeeded in dropping a note, and he said he's got his wife and 5 kids. There's no way he could ditch and all of them would get out alive. So we pulled everything forward and steamed into the wind, and he landed on the flight deck, and we all went nuts. So that he got called up to the bridge and talked to the captain, and that Cessna Bird Dog is now in the Naval Aviation Museum. And one of these days I'm going to go down there and take a look at it.
Andrew, let's pause right there for one more break. When we come back, we'll conclude this story and talk about the rest of your career in just a moment on Veterans Chronicles.
I actually wasn't supposed to be on the flight deck. They wanted to have someone from the air intelligence section go up and notify the master at arms to send the pilots down to be debriefed. So I volunteered. And I went up there, and it was all chaos. And I had my clipboard. It's a badge of office. You know you're doing something official, you got a clipboard. And so the helicopters are landing all over the place, and I dropped the clipboard, helped push a Huey off the fantail, and then all of a sudden the helicopters are about to land on me, so I figured I'd better get out of there. And I grabbed the clipboard and started booking across the flight deck heading for the catwalk. And the Air Wing Intelligence Officer, Andy McPherson, said, "Where's Faltum?" And then he looks up on the pilot landing aid television, sees me booking across the flight deck, and he was not happy. But I'd seen all this on television, and I didn't want to watch it on television. It was history. I wanted to see it and smell it. And but our skipper was up on the flight deck too, and we just sort of looked at each other at one point and realized that these people had lost their country. And there was Vietnamese nuns and families. At one point, we had a bunch of refugees on the flight deck, or on the hangar deck, because we didn't have enough time to get them all off the ship. So they were sleeping on bubble wrap or pads or whatever they could, and there were a bunch of kids, and one of the sailors asked me to draw some cartoons so the kids could color with markers and things. And so I drew up, like Porky Pig and a couple other cartoon characters, and they mimeoed it off, and I said, oh, but you got to bring me one back. So I've got this drawing with kids coloring from the Vietnamese refugees. After that, it was officially called off. We had a whole bunch of helicopters. We went around to Satahip, which is in Thailand, and we loaded all the fixed-wing aircraft that had flown out, the F-5s and the A-37s, the Tweety Birds that had flown out of Vietnam into Thailand. And so we loaded those off. Then we wound up going to Guam to deliver the aircraft to Guam. We salvaged about 101 aircraft. And of those, there was the one bird dog, and the rest were either helos or fixed-wing jets. So it was a rather interesting time.
In terms of the end of the war, obviously, you had entered into the theater after the peace accords had started. So
right. So technically, I'm not a Vietnam veteran because I don't have that that campaign. It's what they did give us is they created the Humanitarian Service Medal, and we were also awarded the Armed Forces Expeditionary Medal, which I guess allows me to join the VFW. And they gave us a Navy Unit Commendation for our role. That would probably be my brush with history. And every time I see some of the pictures, you sort of look for your face in the crowd, and it causes you to stop and think that so much of history we don't necessarily participate in, and when you do find yourself in a situation like that you realize that it's history, you want to remember everything, even though you don't necessarily remember everything.
We're doing this interview in July of 2015. We're just a couple months past the 40th anniversary of the Fall of Saigon. Are those memories just as fresh for you today?
Well, when I knew I was going to do this interview, I went back and refreshed my memory about some of the events. And I went through, in the Navy, you don't have yearbooks, like high school yearbooks. You have what's called cruise books. And I went back through the cruise books, and I saw a much younger version of myself with a rather cheesy-looking mustache, because it was the 70s, and everybody
Sure.
was trying to get their hair as long as they could get away with, and had mustaches and sideburns, and that was fashionable back then.
You left the service in 1976, but one of the things that is often remarked about now with returning veterans is how much the country honors them and cheers for them when they come home. That was not the case at the end of the Vietnam War. What did you experience?
Well, for me, since they were winding down, I tried to get a regular commission. I had a reserve commission, And I just, I wasn't one of the ones picked up for reserve, but for a regular commission, but I stayed in the reserves, and I retired in '95 as a commander. But I could see the difference after 9/11, because a lot of young people joined because of 9/11. And I see a different reaction to military service than the Vietnam War. I was a Chicago police officer, so you get a lot of, in the 70s, you got a lot of that antagonism between all kinds of, it was racial, it was ethnic, it was anti-war, and the authority figures weren't always. It was on both sides. I think one police officer I talked to one time said he described these riots and things as the blue mob versus the other mob, because that kind of conflict just erupted in society, and there was all kinds of things going on. At the time of 9/11, I was an intelligence specialist with the Army, and I was working in an office when it happened, and we went into the SCIF, the Sensitive Compartment Information Facility, to process the intelligence reports and everything. And I just didn't go home for like 30-some hours. It was, but that marked a change in attitude towards service in the military. And it's going to be interesting to see how that evolves in the future. Our national attention span is not always that great, and if we can't solve a problem in 6 months by throwing a lot of money at it, we tend not to stay in for the long haul.
You mentioned your time in the reserves as well as the private sector.
Mm-hmm.
The vast majority of it dealing with intelligence work, which was
Right.
obviously what you were doing when you were active duty as well. What was it about that work that interested you so much?
Well, I guess most of my adult life has been some form of public service, either as a police officer, active duty Navy reservist, a civilian intelligence specialist working for the Army, and even when I retired from civil service and became a defense contractor, I was working on the Joint Staff, working critical infrastructure protection. So the idea of doing a job just for money it's got to mean something. So I've never been shot at. I've never had to shoot anybody, and so I've never been in combat, but at least I know what it's like to be in an operational environment. And I can appreciate those who have been in combat.
And you certainly assisted those who were in combat based on your positions in both places. You also held a pretty important logistical position with the Army in terms of being in charge of materiel. Talk about that job.
Well, it was scientific and technical intelligence in support of acquisition. Basically, when the Soviet Union was still a force in being, you had to have a better tank than their tank. And so you have to know what's going on with their technology in order to field better equipment and equip our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines with the best that we can give them. And so it involved a lot of mostly an analysis and projecting what the threat would be, and then the material developers could come up with something that would top the opposition.
As you look back at your career, what are you most proud of?
Well, there's a couple aha moments. When I was doing the ground order battle during frequent wind, the amphibious ready groups would have to move in during the day so they would have shorter flight, and then they would move out at night. And as a ground order battle analyst, I figured out what was the largest artillery piece that the North Vietnamese had and what the range of that was, and that determined how far off the coast we had to be, because there have been conflicts where shore batteries have exchanged gunfire with ships offshore. So that was my, contribution to the security of the task force. And then some other times during my civilian career that you said the right thing at the right time and got the material developer aware of a threat that they had to do something about. And that's kind of an aha experience, but I don't want to go into classified or whatever.
Sure. Anything else you'd like to add?
Yeah, my wife, I always kid her that she's a historical naval person. But like I said, I met her at the Armed Forces Air Intelligence Training Center, Lowry Air Force Base. And there had only been one other female to go through the course before our class. And we had 2 women in our class. So she doesn't like to think of herself as a pioneer or setting precedents, but she did. And yeah, I'm proud of her for that.
What's her name?
Cheryl. And her name is spelled Sherryl, and I have yet to come across another Cheryl that spells her name that way. Her mother supposedly named her after an actress that she saw in the credits of Stage Door Canteen, movie from World War II, but I think I've seen the credits, and I didn't see a Cheryl in there anywhere, so I don't know
where all that came from. Well, Mr. Faltum, it's an honor to have you with us. Thank you so much for your service to our country, and thank you very much for sitting down with us today.
My pleasure.
Andrew Faltum is a U.S. Navy veteran. He says not officially a veteran of the Vietnam War, but we're certainly going to categorize him that way. I'm Greg Columbus reporting for Radio America. It's our final segment on Veterans Chronicles. Our guest today is Andrew Faltum. He is a veteran of the U.S. Navy and served during the latter stages of the Vietnam War. In our last few minutes, we want to talk about, in addition to what he did after leaving active duty, and we talked about his time in the reserves and the private sector, you've also become an author, specifically looking at different ships in the United States Navy. How did you get into that type of work?
Well, at the time I was in the Defense Attaché unit in the reserves, and one of our production tasks was to write cultural behavioral handbooks. And I was writing the cultural behavioral handbook for Norway. That was a country I was assigned to. And I sort of self-taught myself a passable Norwegian. But my production officer was Commander Jan Snukkergronje, and intelligence officers tend to be interested in history. And we started talking about ships, and I was talking about the Essex-class aircraft carriers from World War II, and I said, I'm surprised that nobody's ever really written a book about them. And he said, write me a proposal. It turns out that he was a publisher, nautical and aviation publishing. And they were originally in Baltimore, and now he's moved down to South Carolina. And so my first book was on the 24 ships of the Essex class. It came out in 1996. It went to 3 printings. I not only did the writing, but a lot of the illustrations for the book. And then the next book was going to be, okay, well now they got that one, how about the Independence class light carriers from World War II, which are largely overlooked. So the second book came out in 2002 from Nautical and Aviation on the Independence light aircraft carriers. And then, since I had this carrier thing going, I proposed a book on the Forrestal and Kitty Hawk classes. And that was originally going to be by Nautical and Aviation, but the Naval Institute Press decided to pick it up. So that came out 2014. And I guess I've got a thing for aircraft carriers, but in the books I try not to make it too technical. I try to aim it for a general audience and explain what it's like to be on a carrier. Because unless you've been on a carrier, you really don't have a sense for what it feels like. Because the flight deck of a carrier has been called the most dangerous 4.5 acres on Earth. And it's no exaggeration. Air Force pilots can come aboard a carrier and they can say, well, I'm pretty good. I could land on a carrier. I could take off from a carrier. But what really scares the bejeebers out of them is when they see these 18-year-old kids taxiing aircraft within 6 inches of each other while there's helicopter rotors going and propellers spinning and jet blast and intakes that could suck you up into a jet engine. And it looks like chaos, but it's carefully choreographed. And the other things that you don't get from seeing a movie or a documentary is that it's the smells and the sound. The sound of when a carrier turns into the wind and the fighters on the catapults kick in their afterburners, the sound vibrates your rib cage like a drum. And the catapults are steam catapults, and they have this kind of a waxy smell. And then there's also, if on a conventional carrier, we've got stack gases. So we used to come home from sea, and your wife would say, "You smell like ship," because it permeates your whole being, and your clothes reek of the fossil fuels that are on a ship. And that's the kind of thing I try to convey to the readers. Describe how planes operate from a carrier and give their operational history, and then I have appendices for the technical things, for those that are interested in the technical aspects.
Just about a minute left in our conversation. Any projects on the horizon?
Yes, I'm going to try to branch out and do a book on destroyers and the Fletcher class from World War II. The largest class of destroyers ever built, 175 of them. Nautical and Aviation is still interested in doing some Revolutionary War hero biographies. So we're still looking into that.
Are you going to look more towards the naval side or more general?
It's more Revolutionary War from the Continental Army side, and some of the lesser commanders that haven't been written a lot about. And we're still considering which ones are viable candidates for that. If I went into more naval things, I would probably get into some of the biographies of the personalities from the Civil War from the naval side.
Well, sounds like you got plenty of work ahead of you if you want it.
All righty.
Andrew, thanks again for your time.
You're welcome.
Andrew Faltum, again, veteran of the Vietnam War as well as the U.S. Navy, and he's still, more than 40 years after first getting on a naval ship, still writing about them in a series of books that we've just talked about. I'm Greg Corombos. This has been Veterans Chronicles.